A woman came running straight at my bulldozer, waving papers and shouting like I was trying to dam the Mississippi with a garden hose. I was on my own property doing approved work near the creek when she claimed she had the power to shut me down just because she chaired the neighborhood board. Have you ever had someone pretend to be the sheriff of your yard? She said I was endangering wildlife, violating bylaws, and threatening fines like she printed them herself. I kept calm. But what she didn't know was that this wasn't her turf to control. This was about to become the most elaborate environmental justice case of my career. My name is Arthur Vance, and I'm an environmental consultant who specializes in water quality assessments and ecosystem restoration. When I moved to Sunset Hills 6 months ago, I thought I'd found the perfect, quiet suburban neighborhood where I could focus on my freelance work while enjoying the peaceful creek that runs through the community. What I didn't realize was that I was walking into the middle of an environmental mystery that would challenge everything I thought I knew about community leadership and environmental protection. The truth is, I'd been struggling with my own career lately. After 15 years of working for large environmental consulting firms, I'd grown tired of corporate politics and compromise principles. I'd seen too many projects where genuine environmental concerns were sacrificed for client convenience and profit margins. When I decided to go freelance, I was looking for a way to do meaningful work that actually made a difference for local ecosystems and communities. Sunset Hills seemed like the perfect fresh start. The neighborhood was established in the 1970s, with mature oak trees lining quiet streets and a natural creek that meandered through the community before connecting to the larger Cedar River watershed. The houses were modest but well-maintained, and the residents seemed genuinely committed to preserving the area's natural character. Property values were reasonable, and I was able to purchase a small house with direct creek access that would be perfect for my restoration work. The morning everything changed started peacefully enough. I was standing next to the small excavator I'd rented to begin my creek restoration project, reviewing the permits I'd obtained from the county for the work. Every document was in order: environmental impact assessment, water quality permits, restoration plan approved by the state environmental agency. I'd spent 3 months preparing for this project, consulting with hydrologists, soil scientists, and aquatic biologists to develop a comprehensive restoration plan that would improve water quality while enhancing habitat for local wildlife. The project was designed to address several environmental issues I'd observed during my initial site assessment. The creek had been channelized decades earlier, creating unnatural flow patterns that led to erosion and sedimentation problems. Invasive plant species had colonized the banks, crowding out native vegetation that provided critical habitat and natural water filtration. Most concerning, I'd noticed signs of chemical contamination in the water, unusual algae growth, absence of sensitive aquatic species, and occasional fish kills that suggested ongoing pollution problems. My restoration plan involved carefully removing invasive species, replanting native vegetation, installing natural erosion control measures, and creating shallow pools and riffle areas to improve water oxygenation and habitat diversity. The work would take several months to complete, but the long-term benefits would be substantial improved water quality, enhanced wildlife habitat, and natural flood control that would protect downstream properties. That's when I heard rapid footsteps on gravel and turned to see Joyce Halverson marching toward me with the determination of a general leading troops into battle. Joyce was the chairman of the Sunset Hills Neighborhood Management Board, a position she'd held for 3 years, and wielded with the authority of someone who genuinely believed she was saving the world, one regulation at a time. Joyce was a woman in her early 50s, with perfectly styled gray hair, and the kind of professional demeanor that made people automatically assume she knew what she was talking about. She was dressed in what looked like a uniform khaki pants, a white button-down shirt, and a green vest with environmental protection embroidered on the chest. She carried a leather-bound clipboard and moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Stop! Stop right there!" Joyce commanded, positioning herself directly between my equipment and the creek. "I am Joyce Halverson, chairman of the Sunset Hills Neighborhood Management Board, and I am ordering you to cease this environmentally destructive activity immediately." Her voice carried absolute conviction, and I could see several neighbors gathering on their porches to watch the confrontation. Joyce clearly intended this to be a public demonstration of her authority and environmental expertise. I looked at her with what I hoped was polite confusion. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I have all the proper permits for this creek restoration project," I said, holding up my documentation. "According to my paperwork, this should all be perfectly legal. If there's some neighborhood regulation I'm not aware of, could you please explain what I need to do to comply?" What I didn't know at the time was that Joyce had a complex personal history that drove her obsession with environmental authority. She'd grown up in a family where her father was a respected civil engineer who'd worked on major infrastructure projects throughout the region. Her childhood had been filled with dinner table conversations about environmental regulations, water quality standards, and the importance of protecting natural resources. Her father had always emphasized that environmental protection was both a scientific discipline and a moral responsibility. Joyce had initially planned to follow in her father's footsteps, studying environmental science in college with the goal of becoming a professional consultant or government regulator. But her academic performance had been mediocre, and she'd struggled with the complex chemistry and biology coursework required for environmental science. After switching majors twice, she'd eventually graduated with a degree in business administration and spent 20 years working in corporate human resources. Her marriage to Robert Halverson had been stable for 15 years, but it had fallen apart when Robert had an affair with a younger colleague. The divorce had been devastating for Joyce, both emotionally and financially. She'd lost the house they'd shared, most of their savings, and the social identity she'd built around being a successful corporate wife. Moving to Sunset Hills had been her attempt to start over, and she'd thrown herself into community leadership as a way to rebuild her sense of purpose and authority. Joyce's environmental activism had started genuinely. She'd been horrified by the condition of the community creek when she'd first moved to the neighborhood. The water was murky, the banks were overgrown with invasive species, and she'd occasionally seen dead fish floating in the stagnant pools. She'd organized creek cleanup events, lobbied for better stormwater management, and researched environmental regulations with the dedication of someone trying to master a subject she'd never formally studied. But over time, Joyce's environmental advocacy had become more about maintaining her position of power than actually protecting the environment. She discovered that environmental concerns were an effective way to control community decisions and establish her authority over neighbors. Environmental regulations were complex and technical, which made it easy to intimidate residents who lacked expertise. Environmental violations carried serious penalties, which made her threats credible and frightening. Joyce barely glanced at my permits before declaring, "These local permits mean nothing when they conflict with federal environmental protection laws, which I have studied extensively. As the elected representative of this community's environmental interests, I have full authority to halt any project that poses a threat to our natural habitat." She pulled out a handmade sign that read, "Construction Prohibited, Environmental Protection Zone," and planted it firmly in the ground. The sign was professionally made, with official-looking fonts and a green color scheme that suggested government authority. "I appreciate your concern for the environment," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "Could you tell me specifically which federal regulations you believe this project violates? I want to make sure I'm in complete compliance with all applicable laws." Joyce's face flushed slightly, And for a moment, I saw uncertainty flicker across her features. "The regulations are complex and technical," she said, regaining her composure. "The Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, all of these could be relevant to your project. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the appropriate federal agencies. In the meantime, this area is under my protection." Her response was vague enough to sound authoritative, while avoiding specific details that might expose her limited knowledge. It was a technique I'd seen before from people who wanted to appear knowledgeable without actually understanding the subject matter. "I understand your concerns," I said, deciding to probe a little deeper. "Could you tell me which specific provisions of the Clean Water Act you think might apply here? I want to make sure I'm not inadvertently violating any wetland protection requirements." Joyce's hesitation was brief, but telling. "Section 404 permits, obviously," she said, referencing the most commonly known Clean Water Act provision, "and the anti-degradation requirements under the state water quality standards. Plus, the National Environmental Policy Act requires environmental impact assessments for any project that might affect federal waters." Her answer was sophisticated enough to sound knowledgeable to most residents, but I could tell she was repeating information she'd researched, rather than drawing on deep understanding. More importantly, none of the regulations she cited actually applied to my project, which was being conducted on private property under state permits that had already addressed all federal requirements. "I appreciate you taking the time to explain these concerns," I said, maintaining my polite tone. "I'll contact my environmental attorney to make sure we're addressing all applicable regulations. In the meantime, I'll hold off on any work until we can resolve these issues." Joyce's satisfaction was obvious. She'd successfully asserted her authority and demonstrated her environmental expertise in front of the gathered neighbors. As she walked away, several residents approached her to express their support and gratitude for protecting the community's natural resources. What I didn't realize at the time was that Joyce had been feeling increasingly threatened by my presence in the neighborhood. She'd learned that I was an environmental consultant, and she was worried that my professional expertise might undermine her authority. She'd spent years building her reputation as the community's environmental expert, and she couldn't afford to have that challenged by someone with actual credentials and knowledge. Over the following weeks, I found myself caught in an escalating battle with Joyce that seemed to have little to do with actual environmental protection. She issued violation notices for everything from the color of my mailbox to the types of plants in my garden. Each notice was elaborately detailed, with references to obscure regulations and scientific-sounding explanations for why my property posed environmental risks. The violation notices were masterpieces of bureaucratic intimidation. They included official-looking letterhead, multiple signatures and stamps, and detailed citations of environmental regulations that sounded authoritative, but were often misapplied or irrelevant. The fines were substantial, ranging from $200 to $500 per violation, and each notice included a warning that failure to comply could result in additional penalties and legal action. Each notice also came with recommendations to use specific contractors to address the violations, always the same company. Green Valley Environmental Services, owned by Marcus Thompson. I learned that Marcus was Joyce's brother-in-law, which explained the consistent recommendations and the obviously inflated prices he charged for his services. The pattern was sophisticated and systematic. Joyce would identify or create environmental violations, issue official-looking citations with substantial fines, then recommend her brother-in-law's company to fix the problems at premium prices. It was a scheme that had been operating for years, generating thousands of dollars in revenue while systematically intimidating residents who might question Joyce's authority. My real concern began when I noticed dead fish floating in the creek behind my property. As an environmental consultant, I immediately recognized the signs of chemical contamination. The fish were all the same species and age class, suggesting acute toxicity rather than natural mortality. The deaths were occurring in a specific stretch of the creek, which indicated a point source of pollution rather than general water quality problems. I started documenting everything, taking water samples, photographing the dead fish, and recording the exact locations where I found them. The pattern was consistent. Fish kills occurred every 2 to 3 weeks, always in the same general area, and always involving the same species of minnows and small bass that were particularly sensitive to chemical contamination. The water samples I collected showed elevated levels of several herbicides and pesticides, chemicals that were commonly used for vegetation management but were prohibited for use near waterways. The concentrations were high enough to be lethal to aquatic life, and the timing of the fish kills corresponded exactly with the chemical applications. During this time, I began having conversations with other residents about Joyce's leadership and the environmental issues in the community. What I discovered was a disturbing pattern of intimidation and financial exploitation that had been operating for years. The Henderson family had been forced to hire Green Valley Environmental Services for an emergency cleanup after Joyce declared their backyard vegetable garden a groundwater contamination risk. The project had cost them $3,200 and involved removing perfectly healthy soil and replacing it with expensive, environmentally safe alternatives. The Hendersons had been told that their tomato plants were attracting pest species that could spread to neighboring properties and disrupt the local ecosystem. The Kowalski family had been fined $800 for installing a bird feeder that Joyce claimed was disrupting natural feeding patterns and creating artificial wildlife concentration zones that violated federal wildlife protection regulations. They'd been forced to hire Green Valley Environmental Services to remediate their backyard by removing the bird feeder and installing natural habitat enhancement features that looked suspiciously like expensive landscaping. The most troubling case was Maria Santos, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her 3 children. Joyce had declared Maria's backyard children's play area a soil contamination hazard and forced her to hire Green Valley Environmental Services to replace the mulch and install a drainage system that cost $4,500. Maria had been told that the existing play area posed risks to her children's health and could contaminate the groundwater that fed into the community creek. I didn't know how to argue with her, Maria told me, tears in her eyes. She showed me all these official-looking documents and talked about federal laws and health risks. I was terrified that if I didn't comply, she might report me to the government, and I could lose my house or have my children taken away. Maria had been forced to take out a high-interest loan to pay for the work, and she was still struggling to make the monthly payments. The financial stress had been enormous, and she'd been forced to take on additional work hours that meant less time with her children. As I documented these patterns, I began to suspect that Joyce wasn't just overzealous about environmental protection. She was systematically defrauding the community. But I needed more evidence, and I needed to be careful about how I gathered it. Joyce had considerable authority in the neighborhood, and I couldn't afford to have her discover my investigation before I was ready to act. The breakthrough came when I installed security cameras around my property to document Joyce's continued harassment. The cameras were positioned to cover the creek area behind my house, and I was hoping to capture evidence of Joyce's violation notices and intimidation tactics. What I captured was far more damaging than I'd expected. The footage showed Joyce personally directing workers from Green Valley Environmental Services as they applied chemicals directly to the creek bank. She was pointing to specific areas where she wanted concentrated treatment, and the workers were using industrial spraying equipment to distribute what appeared to be herbicides and pesticides throughout the riparian ecosystem. The video was crystal clear and devastating. Joyce was standing beside the creek, wearing rubber gloves and holding a clipboard, while two workers in protective gear sprayed chemicals directly into the water and onto the vegetation along the banks. She was clearly in charge of the operation, directing the workers to specific locations and supervising the application of chemicals that were obviously prohibited for use in aquatic environments. Joyce was personally supervising the systematic poisoning of the very creek she claimed to protect. The irony was staggering and infuriating. While she was issuing violation notices to residents for minor infractions, like unapproved mailbox colors, she was committing serious environmental crimes using community funds. The chemicals she was authorizing were not only prohibited for use near waterways, but they were directly causing the fish deaths I'd been documenting. As I reviewed the footage, I could see the methodical nature of Joyce's environmental crimes. She had a systematic approach to chemical application, treating different sections of the creek on a rotating schedule. The workers were using professional-grade equipment and following what appeared to be detailed protocols for chemical distribution. This wasn't casual or accidental pollution. It was systematic environmental destruction, carried out under the guise of environmental protection. But as I gathered more evidence, I realized I was in danger of being discovered. Joyce had been asking questions about my background, and I'd noticed Marcus Thompson driving slowly past my house several times. I suspected they were becoming suspicious of my activities and my obvious expertise in environmental matters. The situation became more precarious when Dr. Sarah Chen, a marine biologist who'd recently moved to the neighborhood, began attending HOA meetings and politely questioning some of Joyce's environmental claims. Dr. Chen had a PhD in aquatic ecology and 20 years of experience with environmental consulting, and she was clearly knowledgeable enough to recognize that Joyce's explanations often didn't make scientific sense. "I'm concerned about the fish kills we've been seeing in the creek," Dr. Chen said during one board meeting. "The pattern suggests chemical contamination, and I think we should bring in professional environmental consultants to investigate." Joyce's reaction was immediate and defensive. "I've been monitoring the water quality personally, and I can assure you that the fish deaths are natural mortality associated with seasonal temperature changes and natural predation cycles. Bringing in outside consultants would be unnecessary and expensive." Dr. Chen persisted politely but firmly. "I'd be happy to volunteer my expertise to help investigate the issue. I have access to laboratory resources that could help us identify any contamination problems." "That won't be necessary," Joyce said, her voice becoming sharp. "I have extensive experience with water quality issues, and I can assure you that the situation is under control. We don't need outside interference in our environmental management." The tension in the room was palpable, and I could see that Joyce was feeling genuinely threatened by Dr. Chen's expertise and offers to help. After the meeting, Joyce approached me with a forced smile and renewed interest in my background and activities. "I understand you're also involved in environmental work," she said, studying my face carefully. "Perhaps you could help me explain to Dr. Chen why outside consultants aren't necessary for our creek management." I realized that Joyce was trying to recruit me as an ally against Dr. Chen, which meant she was becoming suspicious of anyone with environmental expertise. I needed to be extremely careful about how I responded. "I appreciate your confidence in my knowledge," I said carefully, "but I think Dr. Chen's offer to help investigate the fish kills is generous and could be valuable for the community. Water quality issues can be complex, and multiple perspectives are often helpful." Joyce's smile became strained, and I could see that my response had increased, rather than decreased, her suspicions about my loyalties and expertise. The situation escalated when Joyce decided to take more aggressive action against what she perceived as threats to her authority. She called an emergency community meeting to address what she called destructive environmental behavior by residents threatening our shared natural resources. The meeting notice was dramatically worded and included a photograph of me standing next to my excavator, with a caption reading, "Emergency Community Discussion regarding unauthorized environmental activities that pose risks to our creek ecosystem and wildlife habitat." Joyce was clearly preparing to make me a public example and potentially force me to leave the neighborhood. She'd done similar things to other residents who'd questioned her authority, and she'd been successful in driving away several families who'd challenged her environmental regulations. The meeting was held in the community center, and Joyce had clearly spent considerable time preparing. She'd brought professional quality equipment, including a large easel, multiple printed charts and graphs, and what appeared to be scientific reports and government documents. The entire setup was designed to make her appear authoritative and well-prepared, like a government scientist conducting an important public hearing. The room was packed with residents, many of whom looked concerned and confused about the environmental crisis Joyce had described in her meeting notice. I could see Maria Santos in the back row, looking worried and avoiding eye contact with me. Dr. Chen was also present, sitting toward the front with a notebook and a skeptical expression. Joyce began her presentation by establishing her credentials and authority, speaking with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged on environmental matters. She didn't just speak, she performed, with dramatic gestures and carefully modulated voice inflections that suggested both scientific expertise and deep concern for community welfare. As your elected environmental protection representative and chairman of our neighborhood management board, I have made it my personal and professional responsibility to understand environmental law more thoroughly than most government bureaucrats, she announced with obvious pride. Tonight, I'm going to present evidence of environmental violations that threaten the very foundation of our community's natural resources. The centerpiece of Joyce's presentation was an elaborate poster titled Environmental Protection Standards for Sunset Hills Community. The poster included several hand-drawn charts and graphs that looked impressively scientific, but were actually meaningless from any legitimate environmental standpoint. She pointed to various colored sections while explaining pollution risk factors and ecosystem disruption potential levels that made my creek restoration project sound like an environmental catastrophe. "This unauthorized construction activity," Joyce said, pointing to the photograph of me with my excavator, "represents a fundamental threat to our creek ecosystem. Heavy machinery like this can destroy delicate root systems, compact sensitive soil structures, and traumatize local wildlife populations during their critical breeding and nesting seasons." She characterized my restoration project as selfish cosmetic landscaping that prioritizes individual property values over community environmental health and the welfare of our shared natural resources. Most effectively, she framed the entire situation as a fundamental test of whether the community would stand together to protect their natural environment or allow individual residents to exploit and damage it for personal gain. The presentation was sophisticated enough to convince residents who lacked environmental expertise, but I could see Dr. Chen taking notes with an increasingly skeptical expression. Joyce's scientific explanations were impressive sounding, but fundamentally flawed, and her characterization of my restoration project showed that she either didn't understand what I was trying to accomplish or was deliberately misrepresenting it. The community's response was exactly what Joyce had orchestrated. Residents who had been friendly neighbors suddenly looked at me with suspicion and hostility. The emotional manipulation was expertly executed, Joyce had turned a technical environmental issue into a moral question about community values and individual responsibility. "Why didn't you consult with Joyce before starting this project?" asked Lisa Morgan, a young mother holding her toddler. "She's always protected our environment and kept our families safe." "Are you responsible for those fish deaths we've been seeing?" demanded Frank Patterson, an elderly man who'd lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. "Did your planning and construction cause this contamination?" "You don't even recycle properly," added Tommy Rodriguez, a teenager with a skateboard. "How can we trust you with our creek when you can't even sort your garbage correctly?" The questions and accusations came from all directions, creating an overwhelming wall of community pressure. I felt like I was standing trial with no judge, just one very loud prosecutor, and a jury that had already been convinced of my guilt. The pressure was intense, and I found myself genuinely questioning whether I should reveal what I knew about Joyce's crimes. Every professional instinct screamed at me to present the evidence I'd collected and expose her systematic environmental violations. But I wasn't ready yet. I needed Joyce to feel completely confident in her victory, because overconfidence would lead her to make the mistakes I needed to build an airtight case. When the questions and criticisms reached their peak intensity, I knew this was the moment for my most critical performance. It was the hardest acting job of my career, requiring me to appear defeated and submissive while maintaining my long-term strategy. I stood up slowly and responded with exactly the kind of humble submission that I knew would satisfy Joyce's need for public validation and community recognition. "I want everyone here to know that I've been listening very carefully to all of your legitimate concerns tonight," I said, forcing my voice to sound contrite and defeated. "I've learned a tremendous amount about environmental protection from Joyce's comprehensive presentation." I paused, letting the apparent humility sink in before continuing. "If this community truly believes that my project poses any kind of threat to our shared natural resources and wildlife, then I will immediately halt all activities and completely reconsider my entire approach to creek restoration." My capitulation was perfectly calibrated to give Joyce exactly the kind of public victory she craved, while positioning myself as the humbled, defeated resident who had learned his place in the community hierarchy. The response was immediate and exactly what Joyce had been seeking. Residents applauded her environmental expertise and community leadership enthusiastically, thanking her for protecting the neighborhood from my environmental recklessness and potential ecological damage. "Thank you for standing up to him," said Mrs. Patterson, approaching Joyce with obvious gratitude. "We're so lucky to have someone with your knowledge protecting our environment." "I can't believe he thought he could just start digging up the creek without consulting you first," added Mr. Thompson. "What if he had caused permanent damage to our ecosystem?" Joyce herself appeared deeply satisfied by the public demonstration of her authority and the community's clear recognition of her superior environmental knowledge. She spent an additional 20 minutes after the formal meeting, explaining to gathered residents how they could identify and report future environmental threats, positioning herself not just as a neighborhood leader, but as an environmental expert whose authority surpassed that of government agencies. As I sat in my deliberately isolated chair, with the rest of the community now clearly and completely aligned against me, I allowed myself the smallest possible smile. Joyce had just given me exactly what I needed, a public demonstration of her environmental authority, claims that would contrast perfectly with the evidence of her actual environmental crimes. What made this moment particularly valuable from an investigative standpoint was watching Joyce's reaction to what she perceived as her complete victory. She didn't just accept the community's support and move on. She reveled in the recognition and spent considerable time elaborating on her environmental expertise and the techniques she used to identify and prevent environmental threats. Environmental protection requires constant vigilance, she explained to the gathered residents. I personally monitor our creek system on a regular basis, and I've developed comprehensive protocols for identifying and addressing potential contamination sources. Most government agencies don't have the time or resources to provide this level of detailed oversight. Her confidence was soaring, and she was becoming more expansive about her methods and authority. This was exactly what I'd been hoping for. Joyce's overconfidence would lead her to make increasingly bold claims and take increasingly risky actions. After the meeting concluded, I walked home alone while most of the other residents stayed behind to thank Joyce personally and discuss additional ways to strengthen the community's environmental protection efforts. Once inside my house, I immediately went to my computer and began documenting everything that had happened, adding detailed notes to my growing case file. The security camera footage from recent weeks had provided me with comprehensive evidence of Joyce's chemical application activities. But I needed more information about her methods and the specific chemicals she was using. I also needed to document the financial aspects of her scheme, how community funds were being used to purchase prohibited chemicals, and pay for unnecessary environmental services. Joyce's overwhelming confidence in her victory led her to make exactly the kind of decisive move I'd been anticipating. Rather than simply maintaining the status quo after her triumphant community presentation, she decided that completely removing me from the neighborhood would serve as the perfect example of what happened to residents who dared to challenge her environmental authority. Within 48 hours of her public triumph, she had drafted what she clearly considered her ultimate weapon, a formal petition demanding my immediate expulsion from the Sunset Hills community for environmental violations and community disruption. The petition was a masterpiece of official-looking documentation that revealed both Joyce's ambitious overreach and her willingness to manipulate community processes for personal gain. It was titled, "Petition for Resident Expulsion Due to Environmental Violations," and described me as a community member who poses ongoing and escalating risks through divisive behavior, environmental destruction, and potential contamination of shared natural resources. The language was carefully crafted to make my legitimate creek restoration project sound like an environmental catastrophe that had been barely prevented by Joyce's timely intervention. The petition included detailed descriptions of the environmental damage I had allegedly caused, the community disruption I had created, and the ongoing threats I posed to neighborhood safety and environmental integrity. What made this petition particularly valuable from a legal standpoint was the fraudulent method Joyce used to gather the signatures required to make it appear valid and democratically supported. Community bylaws required signatures from at least 10 households to make such a petition legally binding. But Joyce was more interested in the appearance of overwhelming support than in actually collecting genuine consensus. I watched through my security cameras as she began her systematic campaign of manipulation and intimidation. She visited residents' homes with her official clipboard and her most authoritative manner, presenting the petition as a necessary legal formality to protect the community from environmental threats. At the Dalton house, she approached with a warm smile, and her clipboard held prominently. "It's just a formality, dear," she said sweetly to elderly Mrs. Dalton, "to make sure our community stays safe from environmental threats and maintains our property values." When Mrs. Dalton hesitated, reading the petition more carefully than Joyce had anticipated, Joyce lowered her voice and stepped closer. "Of course, Mrs. Dalton. Not signing might raise questions about your own commitment to community environmental protection. We wouldn't want anyone to think you don't care about our creek or our wildlife." Mrs. Dalton's face showed confusion and fear as she quickly signed the petition, clearly intimidated by Joyce's implied threats and concerned about how her neighbors might perceive her if she refused to support environmental protection. The pattern was consistent across all the homes Joyce visited. She used a combination of environmental fear-mongering, social pressure, and subtle intimidation to convince residents to sign the petition without carefully reading or understanding what they were supporting. At the Rodriguez house, she told the family that failing to sign could make them complicit in environmental destruction, and suggested that their own property might be investigated for violations if they didn't demonstrate their commitment to community environmental standards. After collecting 5 legitimate signatures from residents who had been manipulated or intimidated into signing, Joyce simply forged the additional signatures needed to meet the 10 household requirement. I watched through my cameras as she sat in her car outside the community center, using different pens and slightly different handwriting styles to create fake signatures for residents who had either refused to sign or hadn't been home when she'd visited. The forgery was obvious to anyone with experience in document analysis. The handwriting patterns were too similar, despite the attempt at variation, and several of the fake signatures were for residents who had actually moved away from the neighborhood months earlier. The completed petition was posted prominently on the community bulletin board with a bright red notice that read, "Environmental violation petition requires immediate community action." Joyce had essentially turned me into a public example and warning, demonstrating what happened to residents who challenged her authority or questioned her environmental expertise. What Joyce didn't realize was that her petition fraud had provided me with the final piece of evidence I needed to demonstrate that her violations went far beyond environmental crimes and extended into deliberate fraud, document forgery, and systematic community manipulation. During this same period, I noticed that Dr. Chen had become increasingly concerned about the environmental situation in the neighborhood. She had been taking her own water samples from the creek and had discovered the same chemical contamination I'd been documenting. More importantly, she had the scientific expertise to analyze the specific chemicals involved and trace their likely sources. One evening, Dr. Chen approached my house with obvious concern and a manila folder full of laboratory reports and scientific analysis. "Arthur, I need to talk to you about what I've found in the creek," she said, her voice serious and worried. "I've been analyzing water samples, and the contamination levels are far worse than I initially realized." Dr. Chen's laboratory analysis had confirmed my suspicions about the chemical contamination, but her findings were even more alarming than I'd expected. The creek water contained dangerous levels of multiple herbicides and pesticides, including several chemicals that were specifically prohibited for use near waterways due to their toxicity to aquatic life. "The chemical concentrations are high enough to cause the fish kills we've been seeing," Dr. Chen explained, showing me detailed charts and graphs. "But, more importantly, these chemicals are bioaccumulating in the food chain and contaminating the groundwater that feeds into the regional water supply." She had traced the timing of chemical applications by analyzing the contamination patterns in her water samples, and her findings matched exactly with my security camera footage of Joyce's chemical treatment activities. Someone has been systematically applying industrial-strength herbicides and pesticides directly to the creek ecosystem. Dr. Chen continued, "This isn't accidental runoff or incidental contamination. It's deliberate and ongoing environmental destruction." Dr. Chen's scientific analysis provided the perfect complement to the evidence I'd been gathering. Her laboratory reports would give credibility to my accusations, and her professional expertise would be crucial when I eventually revealed Joyce's environmental crimes to the community. I've been documenting Joyce's activities for months. I told Dr. Chen, deciding that I needed her expertise and credibility to make my case. I have video evidence of her personally directing chemical applications. And I've been tracking the financial records showing how community funds have been used to purchase prohibited chemicals. Doctor, Chen's reaction was immediate and angry. She's been poisoning our creek while claiming to protect it. That's not just environmental crime. It's systematic fraud and community betrayal. Together, we began planning how to expose Joyce's environmental crimes and systematic fraud. Dr. Chen's scientific expertise and professional credibility would be essential for convincing the community, and her laboratory analysis would provide unassailable evidence of the environmental damage Joyce had caused. The morning I decided to reveal the truth about Joyce's environmental crimes marked the end of 6 months of careful investigation and the beginning of what I knew would be a dramatic confrontation. I had methodically collected overwhelming evidence of systematic environmental violations, documented patterns of fraud and community manipulation, and gathered scientific analysis that proved the extent of ecological damage Joyce had caused. Most importantly, I had allowed Joyce to incriminate herself through her own escalating illegal behavior, making my case virtually unassailable from any legal or professional standpoint. Dr. Chen and I decided to coordinate our revelation to maximize impact and ensure that Joyce couldn't escape accountability through denial or misdirection. We would present both the environmental evidence and the scientific analysis simultaneously, creating a comprehensive case that would be impossible to refute. The method we chose was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than calling another community meeting or making public accusations, we decided to invite a representative from the State Environmental Protection Agency to conduct an official investigation based on Dr. Chen's scientific findings and my documented evidence. Dr. Chen had contacted her former colleague, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who worked as an environmental enforcement officer with the state agency. Dr. Rodriguez had reviewed our evidence and agreed that the situation warranted immediate official investigation and potential criminal prosecution. This is one of the most clear-cut cases of environmental fraud I've ever seen, Dr. Rodriguez told us during our confidential briefing. The evidence is overwhelming, and the systematic nature of the violations suggests criminal intent rather than accidental contamination. Dr. Rodriguez agreed to conduct an official investigation that would include community interviews, environmental sampling, and review of financial records. Most importantly, he would confront Joyce directly with the evidence we'd collected and give her an opportunity to respond to the accusations before formal charges were filed. The investigation began with Dr. Rodriguez arriving at Joyce's house with official credentials and a comprehensive file of evidence. I watched from my security cameras as he presented Joyce with water quality reports, chemical analysis results, and photographic evidence of her chemical application activities. Joyce's initial reaction was defensive and dismissive. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, trying to maintain her authoritative demeanor. "I've been protecting this community's environment for years. If there's contamination in the creek, it's probably from upstream sources or illegal dumping by residents who don't follow proper environmental protocols." But Dr. Rodriguez was persistent and professional. He showed Joyce the video evidence of her directing chemical applications, the purchase records showing community funds used to buy prohibited chemicals, and the laboratory analysis proving that the contamination was coming from the exact locations where she'd been conducting her treatments. "Mrs. Halverson, we have comprehensive evidence that you've been systematically applying prohibited chemicals to the creek ecosystem while using your position as HOA chairman to intimidate residents and cover up your environmental crimes," Dr. Rodriguez explained calmly. "We also have evidence of fraud, including forged signatures on community petitions, and misappropriation of community funds. Joyce's confident facade began to crumble as she realized the extent of the evidence against her. She attempted to justify her actions by claiming that she'd been trying to protect the creek from invasive species and that her treatments were based on extensive